Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Evaluate webinar, Biopharm 2022, What's Next? I'm April Constable, and I'm your host for today's session. So I'd like to start by introducing our speakers today. Cem Baydar is Evaluate's Chief Consulting Officer, and he works closely with pharma organisations and investment companies to help them make the best decisions for their companies. He's joined today by Amy Brown, Deputy Editor of our Evaluate Vantage service. She's a journalist with extensive experience in biopharma and the financial markets. And many of you will recognise Amy's name from the many articles and reports that she's written for Evaluate. So before we begin, there are a couple of housekeeping points to cover. So firstly, this presentation should last around 30 minutes and it is being recorded. So we'll share the link along with the slides soon after. You can ask a question through the platform, just drop it into the Ask a Question section, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And please do ask questions as and when they occur to you. We'll try to answer as many as we possibly can towards the end of the call, and any that we don't get around to, we'll follow up with a little later. So now I'm going to hand over to Amy, who's going to kick things off. Over to you, Amy.
Hi there, thanks April. So this is a update on our 2022 preview that we wrote around 4 months ago now. This is a fresh look at the data and hopefully it will provide you with a look at how the year has started. I'm sure everybody is aware this is a fast-moving sector. Things can change very quickly. So I think while a lot of the numbers have changed even in the last 4 months, many of the trends we identified at the start of the year are developing as expected, some not so much. I think the biotech downturn for the smaller companies has been perhaps more severe than many had feared. M&A perhaps hasn't picked up as some had hoped. My colleague Cem is going to talk through the deal-making side of the business later, but I am going to start with a look at the numbers behind the drugs that are already on the market and those still in development. So this first slide is a look at what will be the biggest sellers this year. Obviously, we're dominated by COVID still. Consensus forecasts for the antivirals was only just coming in when we wrote the preview 4 months ago. Since then, billions of sales have been added for this year alone. I think this is all going to be a flaw for these COVID numbers. I think they're only going to go one way, and that is up. There's a lot of contracts signed already. Obviously, as we all also already know, the pandemic remains very unpredictable. So we will have to see how those numbers develop over the year. Outside of COVID, this is going to be the last big year for Humira. AbbVie's big anti-TNF. It's hard to overestimate how massive this product has been. It's been the best-selling drug since 2012. That took over from Lipitor. It's hard to think that we're going to see another product that could quite amass the sort of lifetime sales we've seen with Humira, if only because of the kind of political efforts to curb such kind of monopolies. Even Keytruda, which is going to take over from Humira, when the biosimilars appear next year, the patents for the PD-1s are going to expire towards the end of this decade, which is a big issue looming for a lot of the big pharma companies that own these checkpoint inhibitors. And this next slide is a different way of looking at the big new sellers. These are the products that are really kind of driving the top line of the sector, the big growers, again, dominated by COVID. I think if 2021 was the year of the mRNA vaccines, it's this year as the oral antivirals coming through. Again, open question on how big they're going to become. Depends on the virus and whether it manages to evade a lot of these vaccines. That's obviously going to impact the market for the booster shots. They're coming through this year. We've got the Novavax product and probably quite likely the Sanofi Glaxo protein-based vaccines. Again, Novavax has guided to a couple of billions in sales this year, so it's obviously got some contracts in hand. Again, the longer-term demand for these products remains very hard to know for all of the COVID products, really. Outside of COVID here, it's quite remarkable to see the PD-1s are still growing so fast, considering they're kind of relatively mature franchises now. This is testament to their broad utility, the many types of tumour types they're approved in now, as well as their pricing power. Lilly got a complete response letter for sintilimab yesterday. That's the PD-1 asset it licensed from Innovent. They were trying to get approval on the back of a trial run in China, which I think was essentially why it was rejected. But they'd made it pretty clear that they were going to try and compete on price in this mechanism. Low-cost competition was supposed to start emerging this year for the PD1s, the PDL1s, although I think that rejection probably significantly reduces the prospect of that. There's several other smaller companies are going after the same thing, but Lilly was probably the one who was going to make a difference there. The next slide is the biggest companies by sales. So this is just prescription sales. There's no consumer unit or OTC sales in there. Again, COVID's having a big impact on a couple of companies. I think Pfizer's Comirnaty and Paxlovid is 39 billion is their guidance for those two products alone this year. What Pfizer does with that money is a big question for the company this year, and potentially lots of other people in the sector. But I think we're going to see this ranking change a lot in the next couple of years. Again, I mentioned the patent expiries that Merck's got with Keytruda, but they've also got Januvia. That's their big diabetes DPP-4 inhibitor. That is, I think, January 2023 is the date, although I would expect Merck is trying to extend that. The next slide is, again, the companies whose top line is growing the fastest. Sorry, I've gone back on there. Again, you can see the COVID boosts here. Merck from Molnupiravir. That's the antiviral license from Ridgeback. This sort of analysis would typically only contain the big pharma companies, but COVID means that Moderna and Novavax have managed to creep in this year. But again, the longevity of these revenues is uncertain, so whether they come in the coming years is open for question. It's probably worth mentioning that AbbVie is its two new launches that are replacing Humira. They're going very well. Rinvoq and Skyrizi, the JAK inhibitor and the IL-23, that's the psoriasis and atopic dermatitis markets, very important products for them. And I was quite interested to see Amgen kind of come in here. I guess you kind of think of them as a company more typically associated with the big aging biotech franchises, the EPO, Enbrel, that's their big TNF. They've done very well with their Humira biosimilar, which is launched. It's obviously not on the market in the US yet, but that's already making $500 million in sales a year. And Evaluate Pharma's consensus has that doubling this year. So moving on to a look at the R&D projects. This is the projects coming behind all these drugs on the market already. So this was a rerun from the table we put in our preview. We've obviously had some approvals and some rejections already. A third agent only last night, so that's the one at the bottom, Novartis's radioligand, now called Pluvictor, was approved yesterday in the US. That was an asset it acquired from Endocyte. Gilead's rejection is probably one of the biggest setbacks we've seen so far this year. That's their long-acting HIV agent. I think that CRL was more of a manufacturing issue than efficacy, but that could mean a year delay, I think some of the analysts think. So that's a big disappointment from them. They could have a tough year with a couple of big R&D setbacks as well. And Bristol is probably one to call out again. They've got a couple of really big decisions. Mavacamten, that came from the 13 billion acquisition of Myocardia. And their TYK2 inhibitor, deucravacitinib, that's towards the end of the year. That's been a massive R&D investment for them. There was concerns that the TYK2 class was going to get dragged into the safety, FDA's safety kind of review of the JAK inhibitors. I think those concerns have kind of dissipated now. A lot of the JAKs have got the approvals they were going after. But that is going to be a very big decision for Bristol later this year. The next chart is from the most valuable R&D projects. So these are just slightly behind in development. So this was the table we did 4 months ago. Unfortunately, as we can see, we have already had 3 big blow-ups there. All 3 small companies as well. I mean, these sort of big setbacks for assets that have a lot of value, both in terms of their market caps and from sell-side forecasts, it hasn't helped sentiment this year. I mean, all of these three companies are now worth a fraction of what they were this time 4 months ago, probably. And if you have a look at what might replace these agents, there's not really a lot of offerings from the small companies at the moment. Arvenus is one to pull out. That 471 asset is a estrogen receptor degrader, protein degradation, big area of business development and R&D interest at the moment. Pfizer paid 650 million upfront for that asset, so there's a lot riding on that. That will go into phase 3 later this year. And sotatercept, that's the pulmonary arterial hypertension asset that Merck bought from Acceleron, another $11 billion acquisition. The sell side have put in some pretty punchy numbers on that one since Merck bought it. I think there's hope that it will be disease modifying rather than just treating symptoms. And the pivotal Stella trial is due to read out late this year, maybe early next. That will be a big major event for that project. It's probably worth noting here that a lot of these highly valued assets that are now in the hands of big developers were acquired or licensed from smaller companies. Life might feel tough at the small end of the sector at the moment, but possibly for the rest of the year. But it's clear that biotech remains an invaluable source of R&D for these big developers, and that's not going to change whatever way the stock market is going. Final point here is the Alzheimer's projects. You are notable by their absence. They featured very heavily 4 months ago, but we're still waiting for a lot of phase 3 data. Basically, obviously the problem that Biogen has had getting reimbursement with Aduhelm means that all the rival developers aren't pursuing accelerated approvals now, or very unlikely to. So unless we see some positive phase 3 data emerging, it's hard to see any of these amyloid beta mAbs making it onto the market. Well, certainly not this year, but we have to see what happens with the data really to see how that develops. I mean, I think it's one of those markets that all options are on the table, really. We could see the whole class abandoned, or all three launching next year and the market really taking off, but we need to see the phase 3 data there. So this next view is a kind of another way of looking at where the sector is spending all its money. We've got, this is an Evaluate Omnium analysis. They take real world data and company disclosed R&D spend to throw out these estimated costs of clinical programs. These are an estimate, I would stress. This is you'll always get the projects that have got the big cardiovascular outcome studies, the big long-running trials that will rank highly here. Glaxo's RSV project, one to mention there. It's a big event for Glaxo this year, as is the Alzheimer's data from Roche. So those costs will hopefully come back to benefit them. And this is just looking at the marketed drugs. So these are brand extensions, and it is all the PD-1s, of course. I mean, huge amounts of money have gone into these drugs, but you could argue that is already being paid back. And Keytruda sales, for context, are probably going to peak at around 28 billion in a couple of years' time. So that $15 billion clinical program, which is probably paying for itself. And then the final section from me is just a quick look at the regulatory environment. This is just the FDA's novel drug approvals. I mean, I think there was a lot of concern during the pandemic that we would see the regulatory process almost grind to a halt. I mean, that obviously didn't happen. There were certainly delays, and perhaps the last couple of years would have been even bigger if we hadn't have had those. But I mean, I think historically, the last couple of years don't really look too weak. This year, I don't think any massive changes expected. You know, the FDA's finally got a permanent commissioner, Robert Califf. I think he's viewed as a fairly safe pair of hands. But it is the FDA user fee program reauthorization this year. I think PDUFA 7 we're on to now, possibly PDUFA 8. And again, I don't think anything particularly contentious is expected, although a bill has already been introduced by one of the senators to propose a 5-year time limit on confirmatory studies for accelerated approvals. So this is the way of getting a drug onto the market fast, often on the base of a surrogate endpoints. And there's been some controversy because these confirmatory trials just haven't been done particularly quickly. So they're trying to put a 5-year time limit on that. So I wouldn't be surprised if that gets some support, although we will have to see how that goes. Whether they get something as explicit as a time frame is probably up for debate. But that is all from me. So I now move on to my colleague Chen, who will take over.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Amy, and thanks everyone for joining. So when we look at the stock market, we see that biotech has been in a bear market since early last year, and the current global environment hasn't helped to make it more attractive, unfortunately. Um, while we don't know where the bottom is, we know that this impacts the short-term valuations and momentum to access public markets. That's where it brings us to the IPO market, actually. If you could move to the next slide, Amy. Yeah, for the IPOs, unsurprisingly, we don't see a lot of activity within IPOs. We have just seen one file this week with AN2 Therapeutics recently. However, we feel that there are companies waiting in line until the market conditions get better. Although this seems a bit depressing, the fundamentals are very strong with the R&D productivity, proving that the emerging mechanisms of action and technologies are getting better at solving unmet needs. Um, as we have seen with mRNA during COVID. That's why we see a confidence in private investments, such as venture capital firms, actually. And when we look at VC and private investing, if you take out the peak in Q1 last year, the trend is actually still strong. However, we have started seeing the late stage ventures converging to public market valuation. Early stage companies are still priced at premium, and this will probably continue a bit like this until we see a lot more decrease in public market valuation, impacting both the early stage and the late stage biotech company firms. And if you look at the biopharma buyouts, understandably, Q1 has been a bit quiet, given the fact that what's going on in the global landscape. There have been announcements around from Pfizer, UCB, and Viatris, but we have yet to see some significant momentum. And as you can see in the next slide, the premiums are still high, especially at the early stage, as I mentioned. In light of these facts, probably one question that we could ask is that whether we will be able to see premiums going down a bit and we start seeing more of the M&A activity. And I think we have to wait and see to test this hypothesis. I mean, there's generally no correlation between big pharma and M&A buyouts, but certainly we don't have a crystal ball right now, but probably we need to wait and see what the market will bring us in the near future. Finally, when we look at licensing, which is probably one of the best signals, which shows confidence in innovation R&D, is we see the upfront licensing fees are still on the rise, cementing this confidence. Although we haven't seen a blockbuster deal yet, given the fact that the public valuations are coming to a more chewable state, we believe there will be opportunities, as I mentioned before, in the coming months. And actually, by looking at the projects that we have been involved in, I can say that there have been some significant activity boiling up recently, both in terms of licensing opportunities or searching for licensing opportunities, or in terms of small to mid-size acquisitions. With that said, let's look at some of the conclusions and some remarks that we recommend going forward. As a summary, we can confidently say that pharma has strong fundamentals with the R&D machine working smoothly at the moment. Yeah, we see some kind of failures in the late phase stages of the clinical development, but there's still the machine is working really efficiently and smoothly in terms of bringing up or testing new or emerging technologies to the marketplace. I guess also there has been some kind of a recent article from Morgan Stanley touching on this as well, looking at the pharma productivity and R&D. In that regard, we have 4 recommendations to pharma companies. First of all, you should keep continuing investing in R&D programs, especially in new technologies and unmet needs. For example, and again, I mean, I've given this example before, but messenger RNA has shown its potential during COVID. From the partnership perspective, it's crucial to identify and establish partnership with early stage companies, not from the fact that building a portfolio, but also from the fact that to orchestrate the drug discovery ecosystem, which will be very impactful in 5 to 10 years. However, when you are investing in early stage companies, what we also recommend is the fact that, especially with the emerging technologies, people should take a look at it from a different perspective, shifting from assets or portfolio of assets, or managing the portfolio of assets, to shifting it to managing the risks involved in the clinical development programs, or adopting a risk budgeting portfolio management scheme going forward. Finally, digital technologies. I guess no one could deny the impact of digital technologies. I mean, we have seen a lot of impact, improvement coming out of market. There have been several IPOs specifically in this space, both leveraging AI and ML to support drug discovery. We see a huge increase in the number of applications of digital health or digital therapeutics to develop and integrating novel digital biomarkers in diagnosis, monitoring, and managing diseases. So, with that said, it's going to be an integral part of the pharma or the life sciences to leverage digital technologies in your existing portfolio of products. With that said, I would like to thank everyone to join us for today, and then I would like to open the floor for any questions. April, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the insights, Amy and Cem. So we do have a few questions through. I'm going to start from the top. So the first one, do you expect any acquisitions among big pharma companies in 2022? Or you rather expect acquisitions of small to mid-sized companies by big pharma companies?
I think I can take this first, and maybe, Amy can share her opinions about this. I think we will be seeing a big buyout this year. Although, again, this is just based on the fact that the number of movements that we are seeing in this space when we are working with some of our partners or clients or pharma companies to identify some of the potential opportunities and sizing it. The timing, still, I guess, no one could say anything about this timing, whether it's going to happen next month or in the next quarter or later this year. But from the frequency perspective, it's highly likely that we will be seeing a big buyout. But if anything happens from the frequency perspective, it should be more on the mid-size pharma or small to mid-size pharma type of acquisitions that we will be seeing this year. At least that's how we see from the consulting perspective. Amy?
Yeah, I mean, if last year was anything to go by, it's certainly smaller bolt-on deals were the deals that happened. There wasn't, I think the CSL's acquisition of V4, I think, was the biggest deal last year. But yeah, I think that and a lot of big licensing deals, but there didn't seem to be a lot of appetite to deploy big amounts of capital. But as you say, we'll have to wait and see. I think there's probably a lot of we did analysis recently where there's a lot more use of contingent payments in acquisitions going on. So a lot of acquisitions are being structured as almost like a licensing deal. So I think the proportion of deals that are having an upfront payment, which perhaps suggests there's a lot more caution of the big buyers. Also, perhaps a reflection that just valuations got quite high, and it was a way to bridge those disagreements. But yeah, I think the last year's trend was definitely, it was smaller and bolt-ons.
Thanks. And despite market downturns, are you seeing similar levels of due diligence or opportunity assessment activity as pre-pandemic, or has that fallen away too?
Yeah, I guess I can take that one as well. It is basically, yes. We haven't seen any slowdowns in terms of the activities. I guess, as we mentioned, since the R&D is very strong, we see a shift in the early stage, but in terms of volume, we haven't seen anything slowing down actually.
Thank you. So what has happened to AI-centered drug companies? Are there any noteworthy successes, or is everything like in situ?
Amy, would you like to take this first, and then I can give a color on this maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the AI side isn't something that we cover in great depth at this stage. There's been a couple of, I think it's all very early stage. I think there's definitely a couple of AI developed drugs in the clinic now. I know there's a couple of big companies that have floated this year at quite high valuations. There's obviously a lot of expectation and hope there. But I think it's all quite early stage. I mean, I think there is no doubt. I mean, I think it's such a broad encompassing term, right? I mean, it can mean so many different things. Is it how you design the drugs? Are you using it to digital technologies to run trials? I mean, it's here to stay, and I think it's something we're going to hear more and more about.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that perception as well. We see a lot of interest in this area, and obviously, if you look at it from the drug discovery perspective, with some, really good results or initial results coming out of the market, it's still hopeful to see that we will be using these technologies to identify molecules or new molecules. It's probably there will be some kind of realization of the truth or understanding how much that they would be impactful. But we have to again probably experience this in the coming months to a year.
Thank you. And if we assume a favourable regulatory response to Lilly's, I think that's donanemab, do you predict that this opens the floodgates for Alzheimer's overall, or will it still be case by case?
I think it's definitely going to be case by case. I mean, you kind of, I mean, even donanemab works slightly differently from Aduhelm. I think, yeah, I don't think it's going to. I don't think one getting approved will necessarily mean the other one will. I think we're going to have to wait and see that data. There is still a lot of questions there.
Sure.
Agreed.
Thanks. So just in the interest of time, I know we've been on for half an hour and that's how long we said we'd be on for. So I'm just going to make this one the last question. And as I said in the intro, we will follow up with any questions that we haven't got to, because there are a couple. So is there any correlation between periods of depressed valuations and an uptick in M&A?
I mean, I would say everyone hopes there to be a correlation, because there's nothing like a bit of M&A news to kind of lift sentiment and get investors interested in the sector again. But I mean, we've never done that sort of analysis. I can't imagine there's any correlation between that. Just because something's cheap, it doesn't mean that a big developer is going to buy it. It's and big pharma, big developers, they've got a lot of cash to deploy. If they want to buy it, they'll buy it at whatever stage of the cycle we're in. And I think from some of the premiums we've seen over the last couple of years have proved that. I guess it might get people talking a bit more, but I think more the idea that just because everything's cheap, everyone's shopping now. I think that's more just wishful thinking a lot of the time than reflecting any sort of reality, probably.
Sure, thank you. So thank you very much to everybody that joined today, and thank you, Chairman, thank you, Amy, for that. Super interesting. As I mentioned before, we will be sharing a link to the recording and a copy of the slides very soon, and we will follow up to everybody whose questions that we were unable to answer. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.